One place that always stood out to me in Lord of the Rings was Minas Morgul. After all, how could a place that is sometimes referred to as the Dead City not be interesting? But despite the major role it plays in the War of the Ring, Minas Morgul, or Minas Ithil as it used to be called, is actually something of a mystery in Tolkien's vast lore. There's actually not a huge amount of information on it, which is interesting because the fall of Minas Ithil was arguably one of the most important events of the Third Age. This leads to the question, how did Minas Ithil fall to the forces of darkness? As I just said, there isn't a whole lot of information on Minas Ithil. It was built by Isildur as the twin city of Minas Anor on the other side of the Anduin. It was briefly captured by Sauron during the War of the Last Alliance, but was retaken. Its status throughout the Third Age is largely unknown, but we can assume that it probably remained as one of Gondor's most important cities. Yet, just like that, the city was besieged by the Nazgul in the year 2000 and fell in the year of 2002. Since then, the city was known as Minas Morgul and was a major thorn in Gondor's side throughout the rest of the Third Age. That's the history of Minas Ithil summarized, and its fall is pretty much a footnote in Middle-earth's history. This is kind of odd to say the least because it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. How did this happen? Why did it happen? What actually happened? Sure, the city fell, but how did the Nazgul manage this? What was Gondor's response? Did they try to save the city? The answer to these questions? We don't actually know, but that isn't going to stop me from trying to answer them. To be able to answer these questions, we have to talk about Minas Ithil a little more, mainly what was its situation in the lead up to its fall. I gave a brief summary of its history, but there's a lot of things we can infer from the text. 3 cities did the sons of Elendil build in the lower valleys of the Anduin: Minas Anor, Osgiliath, and Minas Ithil. Osgiliath was the mighty capital, Minas Anor was the summer residence of the kings, and Minas Ithil, well, it's more like a forgotten sister. In fact, it's hardly mentioned at all until its eventual transformation into Minas Morgul. So let's look at how Gondor's history might have affected the Forgotten City. With Gondor's rise to power in the first third of the Third Age, try saying that really fast a dozen times, the city likely prospered alongside the rest of the kingdom. But things change as Gondor goes into decline. Perhaps the most important event is the Great Plague of 1636, which sees many of the inhabitants of Osgiliath flee into the Dales of Anorion and Ithilien. Being a densely populated city, it's likely Minas Ithil suffered similar losses, leading to depopulation within the city. A side effect of the Great Plague was the withdrawal of Gondor's garrisons from Mordor. No longer are fortresses like Cirith Ungol and Durfang watching over Mordor. Now Minas Ithil is once again the first line of defense. After this, Minas Ithil receives one of its few mentions, and it's described as being emptied of its people. As Gondor's influence east of the Anduin waned, it can be safely assumed that Minas Ithil began to suffer more and more from the effects of depopulation and isolation. And this makes sense. Imagine you're a citizen of Gondor in the 20th century of the Third Age. How appealing would it be to live in Minas Ithil? Sure, it's a beautiful city, and the valley it sits in is also described as being extremely beautiful, but it sits underneath the shadow of Mordor, which hasn't been under Gondor's watch for over 300 years. You also know that the city has a dark history, having fallen to Sauron's forces during the War of the Last Alliance. Could that happen again? Is there an economic reason to settle in the city? Not really. The lands east of the Anduin have mostly fallen, and are no longer completely safe. Minas Ithil isn't along any major trade routes, nor is it at the end of any major trade routes. Osgiliath is waning, and the capital of Minas Anor and Gondor's safe heartlands seem very, very far away. In other words, by the 20th century of the Third Age, Minas Ithil was likely a shadow of its former self, whereas Minas Anor's star had risen, Minas Ithil's had fallen, and the city was probably seen to be far less important than it had been in its earlier years. Mordor had been quiet for millennia, so what purpose did the city serve other than as a fortress that looked out for an enemy from a bygone age? Of course, hindsight is 2020, but at the time, there's a very good chance that Gondor did not believe Minas Ithil to be under any immediate threat. Thus, it was left to stagnate and decline. This, of course, leads to the fateful year of 1980. The Witch King, along with the other Nazgul, returned to Mordor, which has been abandoned by Gondor for centuries. Now, Gondor had built a watch around Mordor, and it said in Return of the King that it was manned to keep Sauron's servants out. Yet considering Sauron was thought defeated and that enemies could feasibly still enter from the east, it's also just as likely that the Watch on Mordor was maintained to keep evil from escaping Mordor. This likely means orcs that have survived in the ranges of the Ered Lifwi and the Efelduath, or that still inhabit the plateau of Golgoroth. These orcs, divided and leaderless, wouldn't be much of a problem to Gondor's garrisons, but this would change once the Witch King returned in 1980. Evil would unite and multiply, and this would be going on right beneath Gondor's nose. So we come to the year of 2000 of the Third Age. Presumably with the element of surprise, the Nazgul sweep down from the pass of Cirith Ungol and besiege the city. Of this, we only know that the city lasted 2 years before falling, becoming the dreaded Minas Morgul. So how did this happen? This is where the theory crafting begins. A. Gondor did not know the city fell. I put this one first as I feel like it's the most unlikely. Despite being relegated to relative unimportance, Minas Ithil is still less than a day's ride from Osgiliath. As the presumed capital of Ithilien, there still would have been a fair amount of business taking place there. There was also the presence of the Ithil Stone, meaning that the lord of the city could have communicated with the king of Gondor even if the city was surrounded. Simply put, there's pretty much no possible way that this scenario could have been the case. B. Gondor let the city fall. More plausible, but I still find this one unlikely. Gondor had weakened, but were still far from helpless, as proven by the fact that they had crushed Angmar merely 25 years earlier. If Gondor had a lazy king such as Atanatar II or Narmakil I, I could see this potentially happening. But Gondor's king at this time was Eärnil II, and his son was Prince Eärnur. Both were men of action and had definitively proven themselves as generals on past occasions. Even if Minas Ithil had declined to relative unimportance, I highly doubt either man would simply sit there and let the city fall to the enemy. C. Gondor let the city fall, but evacuated the civilians. Plausible, but also doubtful in my mind. Even if the city was besieged, there would be an escape route either into the mountains behind the city or down the Morgulduin River, likely known as the Ithilduin at that time. It's possible that Gondor decided that Minas Ithil was not strategic enough to be worth saving, but that the people probably were. Unfortunately, I think this theory falls apart when you consider the fact that the Ithil Stone was captured. If an evacuation was taking place, surely the Ithil Stone would have been saved. D. Gondor tried to save the city, but failed. This is my most plausible explanation, so allow me to explain why. If you look at a map of Imlad Morgul, you'll see that the valley has choke points on either side, at the pass leading into Ithilien and the pass leading into Mordor. If an army from Mordor managed to seize the valley, they could create a defensive choke point at the Ithilien entrance, whilst also maintaining a route for reinforcements and supplies through the other pass into Mordor. If the city of Minas Ithil is weak, including its garrison, you could leave a small besieging force around the city, cutting them off from help, whilst using the main part of your army to block the pass into the city. Think somewhat like the Battle of Alesia, where Caesar besieged Alesia whilst also being under siege from the Gauls at the same time. Except in this case, the Witch King's army would have an unrestricted flow of supplies and reinforcements. Any relief force that issues forth from Gondor would have to fight their way through a narrow pass to help the city, but with sufficient forces and defences, the besieging army could turn the entrance of the valley into a killing field. So what I'm saying here is that Gondor might have tried to help the city, but the valley was too well defended at this point. After numerous bloody attempts, perhaps Gondor realised that they could not force their way through to save the city, and begrudgingly made the choice to abandon it to a 2-year-long siege, which only ended when the defenders either succumbed to starvation, were slowly whittled away, or made a desperate attempt to break out of the city. Whatever happened, the outcome was the same, and the inhabitants of Minas Ithil suffered a dire fate, perhaps one of the worst that has ever been experienced in Middle-earth. Unable to help the city, King Eärnil II and Prince Eärnur could only sit back and watch as the pride of Isildur became the dead city, Minas Morgul, the Tower of Dark Sorcery. Of course, this is all theory and none of it is canon. One of my other scenarios could be true, or even an entirely different scenario could be true. The Witch King and the Nazgul might have used a Trojan horse to get inside the city for all we know. They might have tunneled their way in, maybe the people of Minas Ithil escaped, but some moron accidentally left the Palantir behind. Who knows? That's the fun part about a mystery. Anything can be true until it's not true. But actually, that's probably an exaggeration. Not everything can be true. You kind of have to stay within universe. We can be fairly sure the Witch King did not use nuclear weapons, for example. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. If anything, I hope videos like this help you craft your own theories, because due to the size of Tolkien's world, there were so many theories there for the making and the taking. Just a word of advice though, make sure if you're ever putting theories forth, always make sure that you're never putting it forth as something that is canon. Purists will definitely not like that, and a lot of other people won't like that either. So always make sure that it's something from your head and you're well aware of the fact that it's not necessarily true. Put a disclaimer on it. If you want more Minas Morgul, it's a fairly recent addition to Lord of the Rings Online, so you can check it out there. There's an interesting story behind it, and it's also one of the main locations in Shadow of War, although let's not talk about the lore of that game. The design of the city is great though, I really like it. I think it's much better than the movie design. Thank you again, farewell, and remember, if there's not a river between you and Mordor, then you're probably in the wrong place.